Hello everyone, I'm Jim Francis Mweze and I'm rounding up my Master of Science in Sports Administration program at St. Thomas University. For my final project in this course, I chose a topic that I'm particularly very interested in and very passionate about, and it's gender and sports. And I'm looking at it from the perspective of despite the rise in women's sports, there is still an obvious marketing gap which is limiting the full potential of the women's sports. Now, over the past 5 years, women's sports have actually experienced, significant growth, record-breaking sponsorships and attendance, as well as viewership, visibility, and overall. But yet, investment in marketing, sponsorship, and media coverage still lags behind in very many countries. I mean, outside FIFA Women's World Cup and WNBA and Women's Soccer League in both US and the United Kingdom, every other place is still playing a catch up. I also want to include the UEFA Women's Champions League amongst, where the sport is flourishing well. But every other place is playing a huge catch up or haven't even started at all, like most leagues in Africa. Now, so the key question is now if there is a clear demand in women's sports. Now, why isn't investment catching up in all these other places? Because it's money that is gonna drive whatever growth we want to see in women's sports. All right, so let's look at a bit of a background. Now, women's sports, contrary to what many may think, or it's an emerging market. No, it's no more an emerging market. I know that yes, many other places, many other countries outside of these ones that have established themselves, because emerging means that it's just starting, but it's been around for quite some time, and it's still a wonder, why not many are ready to commit to putting in the work in terms of marketing it as it should be marketed. Now, there is an increased interest, expanding commercial value as well as commercial sector for women's sports. Even though, the women's sports still receive about 8% of primetime sports media coverage, but then the global revenue, according to Deloitte 2025 reports, is projected to surpass 2 billion, with forecasts actually reaching 2.35 billion by 2025. So also you have another report, Nelson 2025, that is speculating as well, or rather projecting that fan interest is rising, that nearly half of the global population reported to be following women's sports in one way or the other, social media, attending matches, or watching on television. Nearly half of the global population. That's very big. And we could see clearly that, yes, there is interest in women's sports, the viewership, records that they are breaking, sponsorship deals that are increasing. There is an obvious momentum, but then why are we not seeing, why do we still have a stark difference in the money coming into women's sports than what is happening in the men's sports? For example, let's put numbers to, these arguments. The 2023 Women's World Cup, which is arguably the biggest sponsored World Cup, followed World Cup, and a viewed World Cup that the Women's World Cup have recorded, generated 570 million US dollars. Now, compared to what the Men's World Cup generated in 2022 in Qatar, well, the difference is very clear. 7 billion. Yes, that's what the Men's World Cup generated in Qatar. You also talk about the Women's Basketball League in America, where it generates between 200 to 250 million dollars every year. But then, in contrast to what the men's basketball bring in every year, wow, we're talking $10 billion. That's a lot of money, and that's also a lot of difference. The Premier League, the Women's Premier League, which is the NWSL also in the United Kingdom, bring in about 100 million yearly, but the Men's Premier League bring in 6 billion yearly. And then the men's tennis, where we, of course, we're celebrating equal pay between men and women. But when it comes to endorsements, the sponsors want to, pay more for men's endorsement than women's endorsements. Now, this is according to FIFA reports, NBA reports, as well as Forbes report. So yes, there's still a lot of disparity. And why do we have this much disparity? Of course, it's in the media coverage. The story is in the media. The media tell the story, and the media also paints the picture that people are going to, accept and begin to build that mindset. I give you an example. The women's basketball, the NCAA women's basketball in 2023 could not get a primetime slot despite the 2022 championship game breaking the record viewership even more than the men's game of 10 million viewers. That's huge. And despite, yes, in 2023 there was huge, marketing and promotion for the game, which happened around 3 p.m., 3 p.m., 3:30 p.m. But then he didn't get a prime time slot. Why? Because it's a women's game. You won't have a men's final not being played in a prime time slot. And so the media have created that idea, have conditioned themselves that yes, the women's sports can stay there, but yes, when it comes to prime time slots, we give it to the bigger games. That's what's going to be playing on everyone's head. And that's what the sponsors also, look at or see when they are dispensing endorsement money. And yes, this is not a sports problem only, because remember, one thing we've learned in sociology in sports so far, according to the argument of Jay Coakley, 2015, is that sports does not introduce what we don't already have in the society. We already have a mindset, a mentality that, of this gender issue. And that's why we're seeing it play out in sports, because sports reproduce what we already have in the society. Now, having looked at the background, let's also look at analyze these issues historically. Like I already talked about, women's sports have received less marketing, less viewership, less coverage, and that's why it's very difficult for investors to put in their money, because investors won't put in money where it will not give them value. And what's value? The money goes to where you have more viewership, because that's what they want to see. It's not about making the investment for people to come and buy into the product, but for more people to know about the product and whatever value you're trying to sell through that sponsorship, goodwill, or more clicks, more buy, as the case may be. So yes, and then also women's sports is there's still an argument whether it's a niche sport or it has left niche sport. But one thing we know is that the popularity is growing. So yes, it's not the same way you will market women's sports as a niche sport 5 years ago that you will today. Even if you still want to market it as a niche sport, at least there are certain advantages. But one thing we're taking from the niche sports package is that women's sports still have lots of loyal fans and very engaging fans, and if if we're able to transfer this loyalty and this fan engagement to potential investors and sponsors, that's going to be a big one. But the problem is that investors, despite reports saying that niche sports actually have this unique thing about their fans being loyal, but sponsors map out less money for women's sports. Anything women's sports, the allocation is always less, because we want to put our money where we're going to get the value. We're making a business decision and it's not CSR. We understand all of that, but trust me, if we are able to put more money in women's sports, it would mean that we would have more to put in the coverage of women's sports, which would mean that the viewership will continue to grow. But when there's less money, there's less media coverage money, which would mean that the growth will continue to be slower than it should be. And so, yes, let us stop shortchanging women's sports by making less investments, because we think that that's what women's sports deserve at this point. If we don't break that cycle of continuing to invest less, which means less media coverage, it will never grow. But rather, just as Cookley 2015 already pointed out, that sports actually reproduces what is already existing in the society, projecting more in the society values of equity and inclusion, which means that what is good for the geese is good for the what is good for the goose is good for the gander. Then it would mean that yes, we would actually map out as much money for women's sports as we map out for men's sports. And then that ROI we see in men's sports will start coming. So for us to break this cycle and have enjoy the full potential that women sports should have, it is very, very important that we re-strategize the investment strategy and make everything more inclusive. Thank you very much. It is a business decision because when women's sports grow, everybody wins.